So let's speak about carbon pricing policies. That's an exciting and important topic. The global landscape for carbon pricing policies is gearing up to bring the emissions down. And the OECD's latest report on the topic called Pricing Greenhouse Gas Emissions will highlight that the next 5 years could see significant expansion of carbon pricing and particularly emission trading systems. Our projections suggest that the global emissions coverage of emissions trading systems may grow from around 24% today to 30% before 2030. And while that's still not so much, but still a significant increase, accelerated efforts are needed to hit the global carbon pricing challenge target, which is that 60% of total global emissions should be covered by carbon pricing instruments. So these carbon pricing instruments are getting more diverse as governments are tailoring the design of their instruments to local circumstances. For example, governments are taking different approaches to whether and how they recognize carbon credits and other carbon pricing instruments. And with last week's progress on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, I think we can expect the links with carbon credits to get even more interesting in the coming years. During this event, the GCPC partners in France will share insights into their carbon pricing instruments design and lessons learned from adjusting their policy to local contexts. Our panelists will cover emissions trading and carbon taxes in diverse contexts. The GCPC is a partnership of countries committed to carbon pricing, supported by a network of key international organizations and subnational jurisdictions. The GCPC provides a platform for governments to demonstrate their carbon pricing leadership, offer technical support to countries considering carbon pricing, and share best practices from policy implementation. The GCPC sets concrete targets for carbon pricing coverage to drive action and greater ambition. Leveraging the leaderships of heads of state and government, it increases the visibility of carbon pricing as an effective tool to fight climate change. So I am Mathilde Ménard, the Deputy Director of the Environment Directorate at the OECD, where we do work inter alia on carbon pricing mechanisms. And the OECD is a technical working group member of the GCPC. So I will introduce the fantastic line of panelists that we have today to discuss this topic. First, on my right, Matt Toombs, who is currently Director for International Climate Finance and Strategy in the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero in the UK. Then Andreas Picateles, Head of Climate Change Division in the Ministry of Environment in Chile. And James Coombs, that works at the New Zealand Ministry for Environment and currently supports the New Zealand Minister of Climate Change as his domestic policy advisor. And prior to this role, he managed the New Zealand Emission Trading Schemes Policy Program. We have then Carolina Antonen, Senior Ministerial Advisor at the Ministry of Environment of Finland. And then Mats Liebergren, Senior Advisor at the Danish Ministry of Finance Green Policy Center, working on international climate policy, including carbon pricing measures at the European level. And he's also the deputy to the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action, co-leading the work streams on integrating climate into economic and fiscal policy tools. So we have a bunch of super relevant speakers on the topic. And I will first give you the floor 3 minutes for each of you to give your initial reflection on your country's carbon pricing instrument, how it was tailored to the local context and the current debates. And please stay within 3 minutes because we have another round of questions and I would like to have the time for Matt to answer the second question. So 3 minutes each, you have the floor, Matt.
Just checking this is working. Yeah, good. Well, thank you, Mathilde. It's great to be part of this panel and discussion. I've enjoyed being part of various discussions during the last 10 days on carbon pricing. It's clearly kind of rising up the top agenda in the way that it should do, and it's really positive to see all the various discussions that have been already taking place. So the UK has been an active participant in carbon pricing schemes, emission trading schemes, for quite a long time. It was 2002 that we started off a pilot voluntary scheme that then led to the UK's involvement in the EU ETS. The UK was part of the EU ETS for from 2005, I think, believe, until 2020, and then in 2021, the UK set up its independent UK emission trading scheme. And in our perspective, so it covers around 25% of our territorial emissions, with a focus on power, on energy-intensive industry, and some aviation emissions. It's been running for quite. Is working? Okay, you're in place now. It's been running for a few years, so we're now looking to develop this scheme. That's partly by learning from experience, learning from other countries, learning from what's happening in the UK through consultation, but also in broadening the base of the scheme. So we have confirmed that from 2026 we will be extending the scheme to include domestic maritime sector, and from 2028 to cover waste incineration. And then we're also planning to include engineered greenhouse gas removals in the scheme going forwards. So we are keen to continue learning as we do this. I think the key kind of point is that has to be built into the way that we approach the scheme. And organisations like the GCPC are a great way of being able to share those examples. And many of the difficulties that we face in the UK are ones that others are facing or have already faced in their own schemes. So this kind of forum for sharing of best practice is incredibly helpful for that. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Chile. Oh, sorry. Okay. Chile introduced a social price of carbon in 2012, and since then we have been pushing to develop different instruments related with carbon pricing. Currently, we have a carbon tax that was set in 2014 and covers about 25% of the emissions in the country. But it's only $5. That amount has been very challenging to increase over time, even if the social price of carbon is much higher at this point. We are having a discussion now in order to increase that amount to $10 in order to have a subsidy for electric tariff for poorer households. But that's still under discussion in the Congress. In addition to the emission carbon tax, we have the possibility of introducing carbon offsets to reduce emissions in other sectors. So that is a pathway that we are starting to use since last year, and we have successful projects that have been able to reduce emissions through this procedure. As well, together with emissions related with CO2, we have also emission tax over SO2 and particulate matter, and that enables us to introduce compensations and offsets to reduce emissions in those kinds of pollutions. So Chile is working in order to reduce emissions at global level and related with air quality, and that has been very relevant because many cities in Chile face high levels of air pollution. So using carbon markets and emission trading schemes can enable the reductions of emission across several sectors, improving air quality in different places and also in making the climate safer. Since 2023, we have been able to have more markets because we are also setting emission standards, and those emission standards are going to have also the possibility to reduce emissions through using offsets in other projects. So that's also a possibility that is going to be open once this standard starts to be developed. Hopefully next year we are going to start the work with the first standard, and that's going to be related with the waste sector, but probably we are going to work in other more. So no more remarks to give space for the balance. Thank you.
Good everyone, hello. So first of all, I just want to say a big thank you to the GCPC for hosting this event and also the global goal. So for New Zealand, our emissions trading scheme is the government's key tool to support meeting our emission budgets and our targets. And the key way to do that is a strong, stable, rising emissions price over time to support our transition to a low emission economy. So our ETS has been in operation since 2008, so it's one of the first ETSs, and it has continued to evolve and to change in response to our national context and circumstances. So our ETS helps reduce emissions by doing three things. It requires businesses to measure and report on their greenhouse gas emissions. It requires businesses to surrender one emissions unit, an NZU, to the government for every tonne of emissions emitted, and then the government then limits the number of NZUs that is released into the market. So on that last point, one of the key levers we have is the quarterly government-run auctions, which was started in 2021, which then managed that unit supply to then support our emission budgets and targets. And that is legislated through our Climate Change Response Act. And so every year we do an annual process where we look at how we are progressing against our emission targets, and then we then reflect the number of units that go into the auctions to correspond with that track. From a sectorial perspective, all sectors of New Zealand's economy, bar agricultural emissions, are covered by the New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme. So that equates to around 50% of New Zealand's emissions profile. For the agricultural sector, the government is committed to introducing a fair and sustainable emissions pricing system for that. Their intention, though, is for that to be separate to the current emissions trading scheme and for it to be in place no later than 2030. With our ETS being a cap and trade system, it is based on net emissions, and New Zealand is unique in that it permits unlimited accrual of forestry units within the ETS. So this allows forestry landowners to earn carbon credits, which creates an incentive to reduce New Zealand's net greenhouse gas emissions at lowest cost. Just stepping away from the ETS itself, by the end of this year, New Zealand will release its second emissions reduction plan for the period 2026 to 2030. In that plan, one key chapter will be around the role of emissions pricing in driving sectorial emissions reductions. So that over the next 5-year period of our emission budget. So that shows that key role that that pricing plays within our transition. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Carolina of Finland, and I'm really happy to be here for the Global Carbon Pricing Challenge, which we have really recently joined. It's like a great and very sort of well, it makes a lot of sense for Finland to join the Global Carbon Pricing Challenge, given that we have been consistently supporting the carbon pricing leadership coalition previously, and of course the OECD work in terms of global effective carbon pricing has been also very important for us. So it's super nice to be here. And Finland, obviously, as an EU member state, we have a range of carbon pricing tools at our disposal, and some are domestic, some are EU-wide. Domestically, I think we were one of the first countries in the world to adopt a CO2 tax, a CO2 component in our energy taxation, and we still have it. So our energy taxation basically consists of 3 elements. There's the energy content, there's CO2 content, and then also content that has to do with other air pollutants in the fuel. And that's domestically a very important fiscal instrument. Also takes away pressure from income taxation and improves a significant part of our national budget. So we kind of like it like that. We're also a part of the EU, so the EU ETS is very prominent for us. For Finland, the sectors that are within the ETS scope, there's quite a lot of that because we have a lot of energy-intensive industry. EU ETS has been running since 2005, and as you know, it is a constantly evolving instrument, and it is the key driver in also the EU's climate policy.
So very important, and I think we're seeing ups and downs of it. But basically, we're increasing the scope, it's widening and it's deepening, and the cap is adjusted so that it is aligned with EU's climate targets, which is to be climate neutral by 2050. And we have a 60% target to, well, fit for 55, so 55% target until 2030. On top of this, to engage with our private sector, we do a lot of work on low carbon roadmaps, which are sort of sector specific and very much private sector led initiatives, which map out what an individual sector could be doing in terms of heading towards net zero. So I'll leave it at that and hand over to my Danish colleague.
Thank you so much. Hi, I'm Master Lewin from the Danish Ministry of Finance. I might start first with just saying, why is it important that the GCPC is here at this COP? Because the GCPC isn't just a forum to share experience. We're actively trying to get new countries across the globe to implement carbon pricing measures. That's not just because it's good for the climate, it's sound economics and fiscal policy. And it has an aim of delivering or introducing carbon pricing so it covers 60% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm particularly pleased with that because what I'll be talking about is not carbon pricing. It is what the BBC this morning called a flatulence tax. That is not correct. It is a tax on methane emissions from livestock for enteric fermentation. But the Danish Parliament just adopted yesterday with a broad majority, including support from the farming community and environmental organizations, a landmark agreement that will introduce taxation of methane emissions and do many other things in agriculture. So shortly on why that was, how that was done by having a broad political agreement on ambitious climate target and then working the whole of the government together, including the climate ministry, agricultural ministry, environment ministry, taxation ministry, and finance ministry. So we worked together to deliver the analysis, make new economic models that could calculate these effects in terms of both emissions and the economy. And that was crucial in creating the change. So what my message is simply here is that we need to get that kind of message out to colleagues at the COP to tell them that carbon pricing is not just for, you could say, a few select countries. It's a very, very useful way to both finance the green transition, but also generate revenue that can be used for the purposes and creating the incentives for investment in green transition. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much for presenting your different experience. And now we'll get to another question, which is how do you think a jurisdiction can ensure that its carbon pricing instrument fits the local context? And in fact, what recommendation you will give to other countries that would consider, or that would be in early stages of developing such a policy? What should be your main recommendation for these countries? Beginning by you again.
All right, thank you very much. Really interesting to hear about the experience that other countries are, we're all having in going through this. And I completely agree with Mads that this is about working with as many countries as possible about how carbon pricing can be a useful instrument in delivering overall climate goals, which we've certainly found in the UK. I think first thing, every country has a different circumstance. So the particular challenges that will apply in each country will be different. And so we can't assume that there's just a sort of single one-size-fits-all kind of take off the shelf approach to this. That means that each country will need to assess, how it works against their own particular challenges. In terms of the UK, when we were designing, we looked at, what is the state of the monitoring, reporting, and verification process for each different sector? What kind of decarbonisation policies do we already have that take place and apply to those sectors? What are the additional costs? What impact would those additional costs have on businesses? How do you plan to manage with those costs? And which sectors are easier to cover than others? In terms of advice, I think we would say, firstly, in terms of setting the cap, the purpose of setting the cap is to send the clear market signals for sectors to be able to look to decarbonize. But when you're looking at scope, ideally, a carbon pricing model will cover as many sectors of the economy as possible. But you need to start with a pragmatic approach of deciding which sectors are capable of being able to move into an ETS first. How do you do it in an acceptable way, which can bring the business community and can bring the public along with us? And certainly in the UK, we've had a phased approach. I think a number of other countries have done that as well. It's important to build the legitimacy of what we're working on. And a third point would be in terms of engagement. So absolutely crucial that we're working with broad range of stakeholders, as others have mentioned here, so that we get that genuine support from business and civil society to what's happening. So thank you. Unfortunately, I do have to run now for another meeting. So thank you.
Well, I think that it's very important to have a flexible approach. Like we need to study other experiences around the world and see how this experience relates better to the different sectors that we want to cover with these regulations or with this carbon market, because we need to understand better what worked well in other countries and what are the experiences that make sense for our national context. So those different approaches can be implemented in different ways. And to implement that, at least at national level for us, it's very important, the public engagement. So when you design a policy, we have to include the perspective of the different people that is going to be affected for those regulations. So that has helped us in order to develop instruments that will stand still over time because they are strong and have sufficient support to be implemented. So those are kind of the important elements that have helped us in order to work ahead. Also, related with carbon markets, Article 6 has been also a good experience in order to connect those experiences. We have already regulated how Article 6 is going to work in Chile, and that has helped us also to start seeing which projects that can be interesting to develop and in which particular sectors and what kind of initiatives are going to make more sense in order to go further in terms of emission reductions in our economy.
I would echo that point around flexibility within the mechanisms that you create as a really critical design feature. I think for us, like I said, with our auction mechanism, you need to have them ready to go so that as every year that passes, you've got the mechanisms in place that allow you to continue to reflect how your emissions profile is operating and behaving. So you're not having to go back to primary legislation every time to actually create the new mechanism. So I think that's a critical position. I think for countries that are looking and exploring this, being clear on the purpose around what type of reductions you're wanting, gross and net, and looking at that context. The other one is around, do you want quantity certainty or price certainty in that mechanism, and that will determine what type of mechanism you want to design in the first place. A key thing for New Zealand has been being really clear about land use decisions. So because of our unlimited forestry within it, you get into other forms of land use like agricultural production. We're very export orientated around the dairy industry. So if there are incentives through carbon forestry, that can create some really challenging conversation with our rural and farming communities. So if you're having removals, like nature-based removals within your system, you need to explore that, which is why engagement with each sector to understand how things will actually land is so important. And also around emissions leakage. So for New Zealand, we have an industrial allocation. So looking at those hard to abate sectors, our settings mean that they still face a price, but it is not the full cost of the emissions trading scheme, so that businesses are not moving to jurisdictions without a carbon price. So once again, looking at that sector, exploring what are those hard to abate sectors and what price impact does it have. We've got a moderate and a high level of support. So then we have our allocative baselines that align to that.
Thank you. And I find myself joining all those who have said flexibility is key. I think it's really crucial to be able to leave some space for your instruments to adapt. We can see that, well, in the EU ETS, in that it has been able to start from perhaps the easy low-hanging fruit, i.e. point source targets that are fairly easy to monitor and also very easy to place the sort of, well, obligations on. And now we are expanding to sectors that are perhaps more challenging to address, such as transport and fuel distribution. So that's certainly one thing. And the other thing that I think is really important for the legitimacy is that carbon pricing is a source of revenue. So what you do with that revenue is also very crucial. So you may want to address those who are in some ways impacted by the pricing. In the IETA, we have the Innovation Fund that funds, well, development of low carbon or decarbonization technologies. We also have the Just Transition Fund, which is directed at those regions and sectors that are impacted by climate policies and may find it hard to adapt. So to provide that support for, well, green transition is also very important. And yeah, flexibility and use of revenue.
Brilliant. Now, I'll give some reflections on our experiences in sort of introducing both domestic carbon pricing on top of the EU ETS in industry and energy, and our recent deal on agriculture. What we learned there is two things really. One thing is get ministries together and work really thoroughly on the analysis. This is not a job that you can leave the climate ministry or agricultural ministry or energy ministry on their own. You need everyone together, and you need to make sure that you can make a convincing economic argument for those who will be affected. That is really important. Take the time to do the analysis right, get it out to the public. The other thing is that I think echoing what we heard from Finland, the need for smarter policy packages. I think we've seen so far in the past too many examples of introducing carbon pricing and then facing a revolt from the public afterwards. So what we've done very thoroughly for these things we've done in Denmark is look at what are the sectors that will be hit the hardest, and how can we make sure that those sectors so people are able to move on or are supported in their transition. And if you have some good economic tools, you can do that smarter. I'll give an example from our recent agricultural deal. What we found that was that when we were taxing farmers for the methane emissions from cows, that would of course hit the farmer, but it would also hit the land value of most of rural Denmark. And that wouldn't just affect the farmers, but everyone living in the rural area. That sounds dangerous for a politician, but what we then find that was that instead of just compensating the farmer, you could actually just do an afforestation subsidy that was higher, that would roll the land price up. And suddenly you're doing rural just green transition with 2 climate measures rather than 1. And that's the kind of sort of beautiful thing you can do if you have the analytics right and are able to present it.
And you so we had excellent advisors, you know, to new countries that would like to develop their own system in terms of flexibility, engagement, good analysis, etc. Use of the funds. I think it's also very interesting. So now I have another question for all of you. What comes next for your carbon pricing instrument? What role does it play in your country's strategy to achieve net zero emissions?
Well, for Chile experience, the implementation of, we are starting to implement Article 6, so that's kind of new thing yet. So we are part of our new process is that we set a cabinet to work on the projects that are going to be built there, together with other 10 ministers, in order to have a holistic approach of what kind of, we're going to set a list of projects that are going to prioritize, and the list of projects that we are not going to accept as part of the system because are part already of our NDC. This is important in order to coordinate the work with along ministries, and it's going to have clarity for the private sector in order to have a good idea of what are the projects that are from interest in the country. Also, we are working in the same round of flexibility. Right. For that, in the same round of flexibility, we are also setting a system for voluntary certifications related with carbon footprints, and that can be approached for other sectors, maybe in the agricultural sector, we are not ready yet to have a carbon market, but maybe we want to generate a voluntary system that puts a premium in products that are behaving better in terms of emissions reductions or having better standards related with water management and also emissions. Also, we are starting to set emission standards, like I said before, and also there we are going to have the possibility of making compensation. So this is kind of the way that we are trying to develop a holistic approach, because Chile has a carbon budget in our NDC, and we need to fulfill that carbon budget. And to achieve that, we develop 7 sectorial mitigation action plans that are related with each sector, so they have their own carbon budget, and every ministry can use different approaches in order to get to this carbon goal, and they can use a little bit of carbon markets, a little bit of ETS maybe, and a little bit of Article 6, and complement the instruments in order to achieve this goal.
So what comes next for our ETS? Well, 2 sort of key buckets. One is to continue ensuring our existing settings have integrity in the market. So what I mean by that is for emissions industrial allocation, we are currently going through a process of updating our baselines. They haven't been updated for 10 years. So for these hard to abate sectors, they're actually have decarbonized some of their processes, but the baselines don't reflect their actual emissions. So we don't want them getting more units than they actually need. Otherwise, they can actually make money through the allocation of those units themselves. So that's one of the key areas of focus. The other one is around, we've got a stockpile of units in the market. So through our option settings, we've for the next 5 years, we will be reducing the total from about 45 million units down to 21 million units given to the market, to try and actually draw down on that stockpile so that there's more certainty of supply versus demand, so that we get the right price signal that the market needs to decarbonize. That's our existing settings. The other bucket is around new forms of removals within the ETS. So we're looking at non-forestry removals, wetlands, so new and nature-based solutions. We're also looking at technology. So there was a public consultation on CCUS this year, looking at the regulatory framework, and then what would the role of the ETS be in recognizing those technology-based removals. And I think the critical question there is around ensuring that there is transparency and confidence in the permanence of those removals. So we're very much in the early stages of that. And I know other jurisdictions are also exploring CCUS and how that can be recognized as well.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think I'm going to go with the permanent removals and then run with that as well. We are exploring a possibility to include a like a voluntary element in our fuel mixing obligation. So we have a fuel mixing obligation. You have to mix a portion of renewable fuel into the fuel that you distribute. Some of our distributors are finding that excessively expensive and hard. So we are working on including an element whereby you could actually replace the mixing obligation or some of it by financing actions in other sectors, basically the effort-sharing sector, and that would mean that the fuel distributor would be funding activities outside its own value chain, and those activities could include permanent removals, could include other, perhaps even land sector-based measures. So we're kind of trying to raise private finance, given that well, this is the moment many governments find themselves in a bit of a bind and within a very hard, financial constraints. So any innovative ways of finding other ways to finance decarbonization are very welcome.
Thanks. I'll make it a bit simple here. I think we have to implement the deals we've made, and then we have to work on with the partners here in the GCPC on the mission to get 60% of greenhouse gas emissions covered, because that's really what it's about. For a small country like Denmark, it doesn't really make that much difference what we do. The only thing that can really make a difference is if we can make a convincing case and get others to join. So we're here to sort of talk to people, hear their sort of views, concerns, and share our experiences. So I'll be working with Carolina on the EU's ETS and expanded that hopefully to aquaculture. We know how to do it now, so that's the next step. But also to countries beyond the world. And the second thing is we want to make sure that that conversation is made relevant for what's going on here at the COP. My great Belgian colleagues just did the back of the envelope calculation on what would happen if 60% of global emissions were covered with the IPCC recommended price of $40 to $80 per ton. On sort of that would mean that we would get around sort of 1.3 to 2.5 trillion dollars yearly in revenue. That's a big number that can sort of really drive investment, not just because it gives public finance that can be used for adaptation purposes, but it also makes private investments in green technology that much more profitable. So that would make a huge difference, and it needs to be heard here. It needs to be heard in the negotiating room. And it needs to be part of the deal. So that's what we are working for.
Thank you very much. I think we are heading towards the end of our panel, of our session. So we have 5 minutes for Q&A. So let's take 3 questions, beginning with the ladies. And quick answers. 2 questions, please, and quick answers.
Thank you. My name is Alison Docott. I'm a journalist at Carbon Pulse. I'm Canadian, and Canada was partner in the GCPC. Carbon pricing has really suffered in the country politically. I'm wondering from our governments here, how do you think about the cost pass-through when it comes to consumers, especially in an inflationary environment, so that you ensure that carbon pricing remains stable?
Maybe we take the 3 questions and let's see who wants to answer that.
Hi, it's no questions for James and for Andres. Andres, Chile is setting up its carbon market. There's currently also James Humberto from Otis Dow Jones, the journalist. I'm curious if Chile is considering a CBAM-like measure. And for James, New Zealand, there's talk about including a CBAM-like measure as well. Australia is considering one. The UK is implementing one. I wonder where your government sits on that question.
Jim Bektas from Montel News. Question for Matt, Carolina, and for Europe. So what kind of relationship does Europe want to have with Article 6 moving forward? Are we likely to have international offsets after 2030 or not? Like ITMOs?
I think we'll start with the questions, and who wants to answer what?
I can do the pass-through.
Okay, I'll do Article 6.
All right. Is the question on the pass-through, and for our agricultural emissions tax, that was a major issue. We spent a lot of time looking at that, and there was sort of worries that either it would be full pass-through or no pass-through. But what we actually found when we did the modeling was that, say, effects on Danish consumers would be very limited. I think with the deal that was agreed, preliminary deal in August, we expected a price increase in the supermarket of around 1% on food. So it was quite limited. But it was only because we were able to actually model that very thoroughly, we could make the case. So again, coming back to it, you need to have a model that can also look at the economics in order to make those cases.
So thank you. And on Article 6, indeed, I'm sure you all well know that our current NDC is based on domestic measures. So what we do within the EU. Obviously, we have linked our ETS to the Swiss ETS. So we will be reporting that as per the reporting requirements under UNFCCC. What happens in the future is, of course, for the future to decide, and we're now implementing our NDC to 2030. We will be giving a new NDC next year. And at the same time, we are preparing to start discussion of EU's 2040 targets within the EU. And yeah, remains to be seen. Doesn't mean we're not interested in Article 6. We obviously want to see integrity globally all over, also with or without Article 6. So we have a big interest in how these negotiations here go forward. Thank you.
I like that the questions were spread across the group, so that was good. Just on the first question around revenue, I think that's really important for that consideration of the cost of living right now. So for New Zealand, I have two sort of responses. First of all, for every cabinet paper and regulatory impact statement, we have to go through all of the economic impacts of our ETS policy decisions, because our politicians want to understand what that is and be very clear on the impact on power, electricity, gas, and the cost, food, etc., because that is a critical component. From the revenue itself, it has changed between our governments. So the previous one had a climate emergency response fund, where the revenue was pooled and then used for decarbonisation programs. The current government, which came in the end of last year, is using it to actually create tax cuts for people, so that the cost of living directly flows through to them to manage the impact of price. On the question on CBAMs, so we have done preliminary work on that. We're an export-orientated country, so we are watching very closely what is happening in countries across the world. We have not landed a formal position around it. I think right now we're very much watching and seeing how things operate. As a country of 5 million people, though, it is something that we need to continue to monitor very closely. But we have done preliminary work around new forms of emissions leakage policy. So currently, as I said, we've got industrial allocation. CBAM is one option. There may be other mechanisms. And so we're very much taking a watch and see. There's no formal government position at this point.
Well, the same regarding CBAM. We have studied the issue preliminary, but it's not a current policy at the moment for Chile. Regarding inflation, it has been always a concern. Actually, our current carbon tax since the beginning was aimed to not affect the electricity price. Is that in the design of the instrument? It's not perfect, but it tries to avoid that. And now the increase of the carbon tax that we are planning to have in the bill that has been submitted to the Congress, the idea is to pay with that a subsidy for the tariff of electricity for people of lower income. So in a way, it's always a concern, and it's something that you have to consider in the design of these instruments.
Thank you. I think we are reaching the end of our session. So let me first thank a lot all the panelists. It has been a fascinating discussion and comparing the experiences and the lessons learned. Let me remind what is the role of the Global Carbon Pricing Challenge. It provides a forum to share best practices, as we have done today, and lessons learned in carbon pricing policy, development and implementation, and also to organize regular online workshops and events on specific design and implementation aspects of carbon pricing instruments. So you can reach out to the Secretariat or look at the website to get more information on these events. And let me again thank the panelists and applaud them. Please join me.